There's a comfortable lie that most men accept without realizing it, that power is something you learn simply by understanding, reading, listening, studying, as if accumulating knowledge were enough to change the game. But here's a truth few dare to say. Understanding power changes nothing. You can know all the rules, all the principles, all the strategies, and still be ignored, disrespected, and easily replaceable. Because the world doesn't respond to what you know, it responds to what you've become. And that's where the rupture begins. Because while many live trapped in beautiful ideas, waiting for recognition, trying to please, trying to explain themselves, a few begin to operate differently. They stop seeking approval. They stop exposing themselves. They stop negotiating with their own weakness. And, silently, they begin to build something that cannot be ignored. The truth is uncomfortable but liberating. The game has always been about perception, not intention. And those who understand this begin to act strategically. They learn that it's better to be feared than loved, but above all, to avoid being hated. They learn that the appearance of virtue is often worth more than virtue itself. They learn that decisions based on real human nature are more effective than any naive idealism. This doesn't mean becoming cold or manipulative. It means becoming lucid. It means seeing the game as it really is, and from there, playing it better. Because in the end, power isn't given, it's perceived. And perception is built through behavior, not discourse. That's why some men, even without speaking much, dominate entire environments, while others, even speaking excessively, go unnoticed. And this is precisely where the central point of this video comes in: integration. It's not about knowing, it's about living. It's not about repeating phrases, it's about embodying principles. Because there's a brutal difference between those who talk about discipline and those who live disciplined lives. Between those who admire power and those who become powerful. And this difference lies in silent habits, in invisible decisions, in behaviors that no one sees, but that shape everything. The men you respect, admire, or even fear didn't get there by chance. They operate under different rules, rules that few see, and even fewer have the courage to apply. And today, you're going to see exactly what those rules are. But don't be fooled, because understanding this is easy. What's truly difficult is having the courage to apply them. If something inside you awakened while listening, don't ignore that feeling. This channel isn't about videos, it's about memories. Remember who you were before the fear, before the exhaustion, before the silence. Each new video here is a different reflection of your own soul. An invitation to understand what the world never taught you. The power you seek outside has always been within you. If you feel that this journey speaks to what lives silently within you, sign up now, not to follow yet another creator, but to reconnect with something the world tried to make you forget. Because here, every word was made to heal, each reflection to awaken, and each video serves as a reminder. You are not alone on the path back to yourself. Click on subscribe and turn the algorithm into a daily reminder of who you really are. There comes a point in every man's life when he realizes something unsettling. The more he explains himself, the less respect he receives. It seems counterintuitive, but that's where the separation begins, between those who understand the game and those who merely react to it. A man who constantly justifies himself is, in practice, asking permission to exist, and that goes against any logic of power based on real human nature. The truth is simple, though uncomfortable. Whoever is in control doesn't need to explain themselves. They decide, they act, and they move on. This isn't arrogance, it's positioning. It's understanding that on the invisible chessboard of life, perception is worth more than intention, and this is where many fail. They believe that being understood is more important than being respected. But, as has been understood for centuries, Politics guided by reality, not ideals, demands emotional detachment. It's not about being cold to people, but about not exposing oneself unnecessarily. Every excessive explanation is a small renunciation of power. Every lengthy justification is an opening for judgment, and judgment, my friend, rarely works in your favor. Now, observe this in practice. A man who understands the game avoids pointless arguments. He doesn't engage in debates to prove he's right. He simply keeps moving forward. Imagine someone at work who constantly needs to validate their decisions to insecure colleagues. They wear themselves out, lose energy, and create an impression of doubt. Meanwhile, another man, more silent, makes decisions with clarity, takes calculated risks, and doesn't justify himself. He simply presents results. Who do you think will be seen as a leader? Here's an essential point. It's better to be feared than loved. But above all, avoid being hated. Strategic silence doesn't create enemies, it creates respect. And that requires inner control. It requires enduring the discomfort of not responding, not reacting, not defending oneself. It's almost like an invisible discipline. And curiously, it's precisely this absence of reaction that creates an aura of control. It's not about ignoring everything, but about carefully choosing when to speak, and especially when not to speak. But there's an even deeper level to all of this. The man who stops explaining himself begins to notice something curious. He starts to observe more and speak less. And this change completely alters his understanding of the world. He begins to see patterns, hidden intentions, power games happening in silence. He understands that the appearance of virtue is often worth more than virtue itself, and that communication isn't just in words, but in what is omitted. This kind of awareness doesn't just come from books, although readings like The Prince or even The 48 Laws of Power can accelerate this process. It comes from practice, from restraint, from self-control. And little by little, he begins to realize that true power isn't in convincing others, but in not needing to convince them. And it's precisely at this point that something changes within him. Because by ceasing to explain himself, he begins to protect something far more valuable, his own energy. There's something few men understand until it's too late. It's not time that destroys someone's potential. It's poorly managed energy. A man may have talent, discipline, vision, but if he's surrounded by draining people, eroding environments, and self-sabotaging habits, he simply cannot sustain his own growth. And here's a hard truth. Protecting your energy is more important than seeking new opportunities, because without energy, even the best opportunity becomes a burden. Men who master the game understand this instinctively. They treat their energy as a strategic asset, something that needs to be preserved with the same rigor that an army protects its territory. This is not an exaggeration. It's pure strategy. Virtu and fortuna go hand in hand. But without energy, not even luck can sustain itself. And silently, many men lose wars they never realized they were fighting, simply because they were too tired to react. In practice, this requires decisions that most people avoid. For example, cutting off relationships that don't add value. And we're not just talking about obvious toxic people, but those who constantly complain, who drain your attention, who subtly drag you down. A man who seeks greatness needs the courage to distance himself, even if it causes discomfort. He also needs to control his digital environment, social media, news, constant stimuli that fragment his focus. If he spends hours consuming random content, he is, in practice, giving his energy to the world, without return. Now, compare that to someone who wakes up, trains their body. A simple routine like weightlifting or running already changes everything. Reads something strategic, like Marcus Aurelius's Meditations or The Law of Success, and starts the day with intention. It seems simple, But this is where the difference lies. Calculated use of force isn't just about external confrontations. It's about knowing where to invest your internal energy, and that requires silent discipline. But there's an even deeper detail, and few realize it. Protecting energy isn't just about avoiding what drains it. It's also about knowing where not to go. Often, the greatest sign of power is absence. Not being in certain places, not participating in certain conversations, not getting involved in certain conflicts. A man who understands this begins to operate differently. He doesn't react to everything. He doesn't take a stand on everything. He chooses. And this choice creates an invisible shield. Because, in the end, decisions based on real human nature show that most people act on impulse, emotion, or a need for validation. But he who controls his energy controls his presence. And presence, my friend, is concentrated power. But there's something curious about all this. When a man truly begins to protect his energy, he realizes that it's not enough to just preserve it. It's necessary to channel it, because accumulated energy without direction begins to transform into something much more intense. Here's a line few dare to cross. The difference between an ordinary man and a dangerous man isn't talent. It's the level of obsession he can bear. Most people like the idea of passion, something light, beautiful, balanced. But the truth is, passion doesn't sustain anyone when the world starts to put pressure on them. Passion fails when obstacles, criticism, and failures arise. Obsession, on the other hand, that endures. It's silent, often misunderstood, even uncomfortable. But that's precisely what makes it powerful. A man who internalizes this begins to operate on another level. He stops depending on motivation and starts acting out of strategic compulsion. He doesn't negotiate with his own commitment. And this connects directly to an old logic. The end justifies the means, not in the sense of acting unethically, but in the sense of understanding that great results require intensity beyond the common standard. This is politics guided by reality, not by ideals. Because in practice, nobody builds something great by being moderate all the time. Now observe how this manifests in real life. A man who turns his obsession into a weapon doesn't wait to be willing. He creates rituals that compel him to act. He sets non-negotiable schedules. For example, waking up at the same time every day, training even when unmotivated, studying even when tired. He creates a system where discipline replaces emotion. If he wants to grow financially, he doesn't just think about it. He studies investments, understands companies, analyzes stocks like Peter 4, Vale 3, or even global companies like Apple or Amazon, and starts small, but starts consistently. If he wants to master a skill like communication or English, he doesn't wait for the perfect moment. He practices every day, even if it's just 30 minutes. This isn't glamour, it's brutal repetition. And this is where constant adaptability comes in. He adjusts the course, but never abandons the objective. Because obsession isn't blind rigidity, it's unbreakable focus with intelligent adjustment. It's knowing how to change strategy without abandoning the mission. But there's a deeper point, and perhaps the most important of all. Obsession, when well directed, begins to shape a man's identity. He stops trying and starts being. He's no longer someone who wants to grow. He's someone who inevitably grows. And this completely changes how the world reacts to him. Because people feel this intensity, even if they can't explain it. And here's a strategic detail: the appearance of virtue. Often, while this man is silently building his obsession, the world still sees him as an ordinary person. And that's perfect, because the most dangerous are rarely the loudest. He doesn't announce his plans. He doesn't seek validation. He just keeps going, while everyone else stops. And little by little, this accumulated energy begins to transform into something even more solid. Because when obsession encounters resistance, pain, failure, rejection, it needs a new form to continue existing. And it's precisely at this point that many break, while others begin to build something much deeper. There is a stark difference between men who break and men who build. And that difference isn't in the absence of pain, it's in what they do with it. Most see suffering as a sign that something is wrong. But a man who understands the game sees pain as raw material. He doesn't ask, "Why is this happening to me?" but rather, "What is this trying to teach me?" And that changes everything, because ultimately, life doesn't reward those who avoid discomfort. It rewards those who know how to use it. Decisions based on real human nature show that every man will face losses, rejections, moments of loneliness, and failure. That's inevitable. What isn't inevitable is how he responds. An ordinary man tries to numb the pain with distractions, addictions, external validation. But the one who seeks greatness, he enters into it, he observes, he learns, he transforms. This is where politics guided by reality, not by ideals, becomes evident. Pain isn't fair, it isn't beautiful, it isn't poetic, but it is useful. And those who understand this begin to play at another level. In practice, this requires a rare kind of courage. For example, a breakup can destroy a man, or it can be the most important turning point in his life. Instead of sinking, he uses this moment to rebuild himself. He starts training, improving his appearance, developing skills, organizing his finances. He takes this intense emotional energy and redirects it. Another example, professional failure. A man can victimize himself, or he can study what went wrong, adjust his strategy, and come back more prepared. Reading books like Mindset by Carol Dweck or Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb can help structure this mindset. But in the end, nothing replaces practice. Calculated use of force here means this: knowing when to absorb the impact and when to transform that impact into momentum. And interestingly, the more he does this, the more resilient he becomes. Pain ceases to be an obstacle and becomes a resource. But there's an even quieter and more powerful level to this process. When a man begins to transform pain into architecture, he develops something few can describe, a kind of inner stability. He no longer reacts as before. Small things cease to affect him. Criticism loses its power. External opinions become irrelevant, and this creates a different aura, a denser, firmer presence. He begins to understand that it's better to be feared than loved, but above all, to avoid being hated, because now he doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He simply is. And without realizing it, he begins to build an internal structure that sustains everything that comes after. Because, in the end, it's not success that strengthens a man, it's what he survived in silence. But this transformation creates an interesting side effect. The more solid he becomes inside, the more he realizes the importance of not exposing this process to the world. There's a silent mistake that destroys many men before they even begin, over-announcing and under-delivering. In a world where everyone wants to show, talk, prove, and expose every step, the man who understands power does the opposite. He moves in silence. He builds without an audience. He understands that the more visible the plan, the more vulnerable it becomes. This isn't paranoia, it's strategy, because true human nature is simple. People observe, judge, compete, often without even realizing it. And when you expose your moves too early, you open yourself up to interference, criticism, and even sabotage. Therefore, strategic invisibility isn't about hiding out of fear. It's about choosing the right moment to appear. It's understanding that the appearance of virtue can be useful, but the real game happens behind the scenes. And here comes a principle that few apply. The calculated use of force isn't just about acting, it's about knowing when not to act visibly. In practice, this completely changes a man's behavior. He stops sharing plans before executing them. He doesn't post every step, every idea, every intention. Instead, he works in silence. If he's building a business, he tests, makes mistakes, adjusts, without needing external validation. If he's developing his body, he shows up when there are already visible results. If he's learning a new skill, he practices away from the spotlight until he reaches a level that speaks for itself. This creates a powerful effect. When he finally appears, it seems like everything happened suddenly, but it wasn't sudden. It was invisible construction, and this connects directly to virtù and fortuna. Luck tends to favor those who were already prepared, but nobody saw the process. And at that point, he's already several steps ahead of those who still depend on immediate recognition to continue. But there's an even deeper aspect to all this. Strategic invisibility also protects the mind. When a man stops exposing every move, he drastically reduces external influence on his decisions. He doesn't have to deal with unnecessary opinions, others' expectations, or constant comparisons. He operates in a cleaner, more focused space. And that's rare, because most people live reacting to their environment, comments, criticism, validation. But the one who masters invisibility, he chooses what goes in and what stays out. And that creates an absurd advantage. Because while others are concerned with appearances, he is busy becoming, and over time, this silent construction begins to demand something even more rigid: clear boundaries, because it's no use being strategically invisible. If, behind the scenes, the man himself is still negotiating what should be non-negotiable, there's an invisible line separating ordinary men from men who command respect without saying a word: their standards. And here's the truth few dare to face. The world only respects you to the extent that you respect yourself. When a man begins to compromise his own criteria, whether out of neediness, fear, or convenience, he is, in practice, dismantling his own power structure. And this happens silently. Okay, this time it'll work here. It's not that serious there. And suddenly he no longer recognizes who he has become. Decisions based on real human nature show that people constantly test limits, not out of malice, but out of instinct. And if they encounter no resistance, they advance. Therefore, maintaining standards is not rigidity, it's protection. It's understanding that politics guided by reality, not ideals, requires emotional firmness, because deep down, nobody admires someone who accepts anything. And even more importantly, nobody fears someone who doesn't take a stand. In practice, this requires attitudes that most people avoid. A man with clear standards does not tolerate disrespect, whether in relationships, friendships, or professional environments. He doesn't accept emotional crumbs. He doesn't accept a lack of commitment. He doesn't accept situations that go against his values. And this doesn't mean being aggressive or reactive. It means being firm. For example, if someone constantly cancels appointments with him, he simply stops prioritizing that person. No drama, no argument. He just adjusts his behavior. Another example, at work he doesn't submit to environments that drain his dignity. He starts preparing to leave, studying new skills, seeking alternatives. This is the calculated use of force. It's not about exploding, it's about acting strategically. And in this process, he understands something essential. It's better to be feared than loved, but above all, to avoid being hated. Because true respect is born from the balance between firmness and emotional control. But there's an even deeper point, and perhaps the most difficult of all. Maintaining standards requires solitude at certain times, because when a man stops accepting anything, he inevitably loses people, superficial opportunities, and comfortable environments. And that hurts. But it's precisely this pain that filters what truly matters. He begins to realize that quality always wins over quantity, in relationships, opportunities, and even in life itself. And little by little, he builds something rare: internal consistency. He becomes predictable to himself. His decisions follow a clear logic. He doesn't fluctuate according to the environment, and this creates a different presence, firmer, more respectable, more difficult to manipulate. The appearance of virtue can deceive for a while, but real standards endure in the long run. And when a man reaches this level, something changes in the game. He's no longer trying to prove himself. He's preparing for something bigger. Because after defining his standards comes the quietest and most dangerous stage of all. There's a move few men have the courage to make: disappear. Not literally, but strategically. To stop appearing, to stop explaining, to stop trying to prove anything to the world, and to start working in the dark. Most are afraid of this. Afraid of being forgotten, of losing relevance, of not being seen. But the truth is, those who depend on being seen haven't yet understood the game. A man who seeks greatness understands that reconstruction doesn't happen in public. It demands isolation. It demands depth. It demands silence. It is in this space that he reorganizes his mind, adjusts his course, strengthens his body, and redefines his next moves. Politics guided by reality, not by ideals, shows that great transformations are rarely announced. They are only perceived after they are completed. And this is where a fundamental principle comes in. The most dangerous is not the most visible, it's the most prepared. Because while everyone else is busy showing off, he is busy becoming. In practice, this requires discipline and, above all, detachment from validation. A man who decides to rebuild himself in silence drastically reduces his exposure. He stops sharing every step, every thought, every initial achievement. He enters a cycle of deep work. It could be at the gym, training every day without posting anything. It could be studying intensely, whether about business, investments, communication, or any skill that increases his value. It could be reorganizing his financial life, eliminating debt, creating savings, investing consistently. He distances himself from distractions, unproductive environments, and people who don't follow his progress. This is virtù in action. The ability to shape one's own reality with conscious effort. And, at the same time, he understands that fortune favors those who are ready when opportunity arises. But at this stage, he is no longer chasing opportunities. He is becoming someone who inevitably attracts them. But there is one final detail, and perhaps the most powerful of all. When this man returns, he doesn't need to announce anything. He doesn't need to say what he did or how he did it. The results speak for themselves. His posture changes, his presence changes, his way of communicating changes, and this creates a silent but profound impact. People perceive that something has changed, even without being able to explain exactly what, and that's when he becomes, in a way, a threat. Not in a negative sense, but in the sense of being someone difficult to predict, difficult to manipulate, difficult to compete with. He masters the calculated use of force, understands when to act and when to retreat, and maintains a constant adaptability that always puts him one step ahead. And ultimately, all this reveals something greater. It's not enough to understand power. It's necessary to embody it, because knowledge without integration is just theory. But when a man integrates all of this, silence, energy, obsession, pain, invisibility, patterns, and reconstruction, he stops playing the game and starts defining the rules. Now tell me, how many of these truths are you actually living by? And how many have you merely acknowledged, agreed with, and let pass? Because this is where most people fail. It's not a lack of knowledge, it's a lack of action. It's the silent habit of consuming content, feeling that momentary impact, and returning to the exact same pattern as before. And this is more common than it seems. But it's also exactly what separates those who grow from those who remain stagnant. So the question isn't whether this makes sense to you. The question is, what are you going to do with this from now on? Are you going to continue over-explaining yourself? Are you going to continue allowing just anyone to access your energy? Are you going to continue postponing what you know needs to be done? Or are you going to start, silently, to change your way of acting? Because the truth is simple and perhaps uncomfortable. Nobody will do it for you. Nobody will give you permission. Nobody will push you every day. If you want to get out of where you are, you'll need to make decisions that often nobody will understand. You'll need to say no when it would be easier to say yes. You'll need to disappear for a while others are trying to emerge. You'll need to maintain your standards, even when it costs you connections, and you'll need to act, especially on the days when you have no desire at all. That's the calculated use of force. That's constant adaptability. That's politics guided by reality, not by ideals. And in the end, that's what builds a man who doesn't depend on luck, but knows how to take advantage of it when it appears. Now I want to challenge you. If you had to choose just one of these truths to apply today, which would it be? And more importantly, what can you do in the next 24 hours that proves, not to me, not to anyone, but to yourself, that you've decided to change? It can be something simple, cutting out a draining habit, starting a workout routine, studying something you've been putting off, distancing yourself from a negative influence. It doesn't have to be perfect. It needs to be real. So comment below which of these decisions you're going to make. And if this kind of content is opening your mind, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here you don't just learn to understand the game, you learn to play it.